Well, hello everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Okay, it's April 11th, 2024, and it's 8:01 Eastern Time. Our topic for tonight is stopping the dance of death and pushing the future forward. You will see what that means as we get into it in just a few moments. I'm going to start with a piece which gives the stream its title. It's from Common Dreams. It's called Stopping the Dance of Death, Building a 21st Century Anti-War Movement. This is a discussion involving foreign policy analysts Phyliss Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies, Jackson Lears, who, if I'm not mistaken, is a professor at Princeton, and Jeffrey Sachs, a professor at Columbia University, who you're very familiar with it because I talk about him a lot on these streams. They discussed how to win a ceasefire in Gaza, prevent a nuclear war, shift U.S. policy and funds away from imperialist wars. I'd certainly like to know about that very much myself. With Israel carrying out a U.S. arm and funded genocide in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, tensions in the South China Sea, and the doomsday clock at 90 seconds to midnight, the action of abandoning militarism has perhaps never been more urgent. In this thoughtful roundtable, Bennis, Lears, and Sachs reflect on the state of U.S. foreign policy and how to shift its priorities for a better world. Question: how would you assess the most important aspects of current U.S. foreign policy? Phyliss Bennis answers, I think the most important aspects are the most problematic ones. The focus on militarism that leads to a military budget this year of $921 billion, almost $1 trillion, an unfathomable number, which translates to 53 cents out of every discretionary federal dollar going directly to the military. And if you add in the militarism side of things, the federal prison system, the militarization of the borders, ICE, deportations, all those things, you come up with 62 cents out of every discretionary federal dollar. An interesting statistic, don't you think? So the militarism is, I think, the single most important problem. The issue, of unilateralism remains a huge problem when the rise of the so-called, quote, global war on terror, unquote, essentially wiped out the possibility of a post-Cold War peace dividend, which had currency for about a week, as I recall, and that unilateralism in foreign policy continues. We're seeing that kind of continuing problem of U.S. foreign policy, and then the rising competition at the major power level, U.S., Russia, U.S., China, all are shifting. All are moving in a greater way towards a military competition rather than the economic competition, because that's where the U.S. is unchallengeable on the U.S. military capacity. And I find it strange that she thinks the U.S. is so unchallengeable when it comes to military capacity. I'll say why as we go through. The U.S. spends more than the top 10, the next 10 countries on their military altogether. including big spenders like China, like Russia, like Saudi Arabia, like India. These are overall problematic aspects that are the most crucial at the moment. Uh, I have to say here, yes, we do spend certainly a lot more. Our spending is really an order of magnitude greater than that of any other spending. The start of the Ukraine war, for example, the Russian Defense Department was spending something like $50 billion a year, and we were spending $850 billion a year at that time. So, I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? Just amazing. China was probably spending a little more, but still they weren't spending 100 billion or anything like that. I don't know what their figure was, but it was nothing like that. But this is not about simply military spending, because just as you have to, when you're comparing GDP, you have to use figures for purchasing power parity. I think you have to do the same when you talk about spending on military capacity. You know that for a long time now, the Chinese have passed, the U.S. in GDP when you measure that statistic in purchasing power parity. In absolute numbers, the U.S. still spends a lot more than China, but in realer terms, like what things the money is buying, $50 billion worth of military spending in Russia buys a lot more than perhaps, I don't know. I haven't tried to figure out the comparison, but I'll bet it's more like what $200 billion is worth here. That is a really radical factor of how much money here is subject to waste, which is not the case in certain other nations. And then also the purchasing power parity of the actual spending is far greater in countries like Russia and China and even Saudi Arabia than it is here in the United States. So I think we need really a real comparison of it. And in articles like this, we're not really getting it. Also, I don't think the U.S. is necessarily unchallengeable because you can't measure the challengeability of a nation in terms of how much it's spending. Because the question is, what is it spending on? Yes, if we were fighting, in the United States, it would be, we probably would be unchallengeable. In other words, if the Russians tried to project their military power over here, we would probably be unchallengeable. But really, we have to talk about challengeable in what context, challengeable in what area, of the world. In Ukraine, the U.S., had it directly intervened, would certainly have been highly challengeable by the Russians. Of course, we couldn't even get our people over there. It would have been a tremendous task, to get our military over there. We also have to remember that while in spending we may be unchallengeable, but we only have about 1 million people in the armed forces. In the Army itself, we probably only have 400,000 people right now. Where, as you know, the Russian army is now approaching 1.5 million people. So, in the areas where the military can project its power, we certainly are highly challengeable. For example, in the Middle East, we may not have been very challengeable in 1990, but right now the Russians reportedly have forces that are in the Golan Heights, and certain commentators are claiming on YouTube that the Russians have control of the Golan Heights right now. Well, I thought Israel's control of the Golan Heights was unchallengeable, didn't you? Everybody thought that. Evidently not unchallengeable. So when you say what's challengeable and unchallengeable, it is highly contextual. For example, if you talk about Taiwan, okay, and you talk about the challengeability of the U.S. military capability in and around the area of Taiwan, we are highly challengeable. Every military simulation that we have run in recent years has shown that we would lose a war with China over Taiwan. So obviously we are highly challengeable, okay, in that area. On the other hand, if the Chinese try to challenge us in Hawaii, might be a different story, right? So, you always have to keep in mind, okay, the context. At this point, our U.S. military capacity is in many areas of the world highly challengeable, and in general highly challengeable, because for one thing, we're out of ammunition. We're out of artillery ammunition. So anywhere in the world where you need artillery power, we're challengeable. It's really very simple. Okay, so I don't think Phyliss Bennis has the right perspective on this. These are overall problematic aspects that are the most crucial at the moment, she says. Of course, the critical moment right now has to do with Israel and U.S. support for Israel. It was always assumed in the U.S. that you could never lose votes by being too Israeli. What a surprise! Turns out you can, and President Joe Biden is. And that doesn't seem to be enough, at least so far, to create a change in real policy. So we're seeing the U.S. playing this role as a sole power that is enabling and protecting Israeli genocide. Yeah, the U.S. could do that. Okay, of course, Israel had quite a military establishment before, but we've been able to provide Israel with the kind of ammunition it needs, specifically bombs. Okay, and we're very good at supplying bombs. We have a lot of bombs in stock right now. We're not running out of bombs. We also had missiles to give them, and we also diverted some of our artillery stock from Ukrainian use to Israeli use, and that produced, okay, a lot of artillery for Israel, relatively speaking, because the artillery needs of the Israelis are much less than the artillery needs, okay, of the Ukrainians. But between the two of them, we have, pretty much run out of ammunition for artillery. So, okay, going on with the article. But that doesn't seem to be enough, at least so far, to create a change in real policy. So we're seeing the U.S. playing this role as the sole power that is enabling and protecting Israeli genocide, Israeli apartheid, settler colonialism, as well as the destruction of and undermining of international law. Right. She's absolutely right with that. Absolutely right. So this whole issue is now causing a sort of split in the Democratic Party, but not yet a full-scale split, and she's accurate about that. Too much focus on what Biden personally believes, as if that should have any bearing whatsoever in U.S. policy, but it clearly does. It always does. It doesn't matter who the president is. What the president personally believes is very, very important in setting U.S. foreign policy, whether that should be the case or not. Not taking into account the massive shifts in the discourse, the shifts in Jewish public opinion regarding Israel. But less than 2 years ago, 25% of American Jewish voters said they believe Israel is an apartheid state. 38% of young Jewish voters said the same thing. So we're in this shifting position where there's just not enough pressure yet to force a shift in the policy now. I think the framework of diplomacy, not war, is fundamental. That's been a demand of the broad sectors of the anti-militarism, anti-war movements of the last 20 years, going back to actually before that to the first Gulf War, when the call was for diplomacy and not war, and right up to the present. I think that needs to be our continuing demand for what the government position should be. That doesn't mean that's enough for the position of our movement. There's a difference between what we demand of the government and what we demand of ourselves. But I think what we're seeing right now in the hot wars is that the U.S. is fighting against the calls for an immediate ceasefire and negotiations, both in Gaza, most urgently, and in Ukraine. And that's incredibly dangerous. Okay, and all that is right, but when we look back at the subject of this article, why we're talking, discuss how to win a ceasefire in Gaza, prevent a nuclear war, and shift U.S. policy and funds away, from imperialist wars. What I'm coming up with so far here from Phyliss Bennis is that the way to do this is through diplomacy. So the government has to turn away from military solutions and turn towards using diplomacy. Well, how the hell do we get the government to do that? Just keep calling for diplomacy? Haven't we all been doing that all this time? When the war in Ukraine started, within a month or two, Lisa Theobald and I were calling for diplomacy on this stream. Still, even though we were calling for diplomacy then, and a lot of people have been calling for diplomacy, including Jeffrey Sachs, we haven't seen much diplomacy since then, have we? We've seen an awful lot of artillery shells falling and bombings and missiles and people getting killed, but we haven't seen very much diplomacy. In fact, right at the beginning of the war, in Ukraine, the Russians tried, diplomacy to settle that war, and the Ukrainians tried, diplomacy too. And Boris Johnson took a very famous trip into Ukraine and said, if you make a settlement with the Russians, we're going to cut off all aid to you. And so Zelensky, and then he said some positive things also to Zelensky about how our support would be unfailing and we would be with him as long as it takes, and that he could easily turn down the settlement with Russia that had all but everybody's signature on it. It would have stopped the war in 2 months. And there it was. Boris Johnson flew in, gave a piece of his mind, to Zelensky. And the next thing you knew, the peace treaty, which was very good for Ukraine, especially in retrospect, is thrown out. Going now to Jackson Lears here in this article. I appreciated Phyliss' starting emphasis on the diversion of necessary resources from urgent needs at home in the military budget. This enormous, bloated, almost unimaginable, huge military budget. We are looking at a progressive left that to me seems so fragmented and incoherent in many ways, so unsure of itself that its leaders can't seem to make the connection between the military budget and the domestic problems that are being forced to go unaddressed. So it's important to keep emphasizing the connection between domestic and foreign policy, and a U.S. peace movement would have to do that. I have to say here, the huge military budget doesn't stop us from having a huge domestic budget. I don't think Jackson Lears knows a lot, of MMT. Now, there's no question there's a relationship between the hugeness of the military budget and the tendency to cut domestic needs out, or not to pay attention, to domestic needs. But I don't think the problem is that we can't afford both. Of course, I think one problem is that people constantly bleat about how we can't afford both. That's certainly true. But I think the other problem is one of sheer attention. When you start spending so much on war and you start getting involved in war, everybody's attention is on those wars and the desirability of stopping those wars because of the risk of escalation into a nuclear war. And nobody has the attention to spend on making demands for domestic programs we really need. Okay, in other words, the whole Medicare for All movement, just as one example, as soon as a nation gets involved in foreign wars, that not only eats up lots and lots of money, but it eats up lots and lots of attention. People get involved in an anti-war movement, they're no longer involved in the Medicare for All movement. They're devoting tweets and Facebook chats and all kinds of things to what's going on in Gaza, and they're not saying anything about the fact that everybody needs Medicare for All drastically. Not saying very much about the housing crisis. Not saying much about the general trend of the economy. So, it's important to keep emphasizing the connection between domestic and foreign policy, and the U.S. peace movement would have to do that, but it shouldn't be doing it just in terms of the amount of money being spent in each area. It should be doing it in terms of the attention deficit disorder that the federal government has related to domestic policy. The federal government is just not asking to achieve the public purpose, okay, in domestic policy. And we have to point that out. And that they're spending so much on military stuff is no excuse. Now, I want them to be cutting military spending as much as the next person. But whether they cut it or they don't cut it, there's no excuse for not spending on domestic needs. Going on, it would also have to be an anti-imperialist movement. And this, to me, with the situation we're in today, involves fundamentally the problems of a dying empire that refuses to face up to its decline. I couldn't agree more with that comment. The need for international cooperation has never been more urgent with respect to climate change, but also to the renewed nuclear arms race. Yes. And yet, U.S. policymakers are still mired in imperial delusions, fueling fights to maintain and extend their hegemony in Ukraine, Palestine, and even in the South China Sea, and refusing to recognize the emerging reality of a multipolar world, which is expressed in so many ways economically in the rise of BRICS countries, but also simply in the refusal of other nations to go along with what the imperial hegemon expects them to do, right? In spite of the fact that the U.S. is unchallengeable, right? But more and more nations aren't doing what the imperial hegemon expects them to do. So they're challenging the imperial hegemon, and they're getting away with it now, aren't they? Going on. Multipolarity is a fact of life. Of course, I completely agree with this. It's increasingly important in international affairs. It's staring us in the face, and it dictates the need to retreat gracefully and intelligently from empire, which is a tricky business, I realize. But I think it's absolutely crucial for our own and indeed the planet's survival. The other point I want to mention in connection with this, though, is the complicity of media stenographers like the ones who work at the New York Times and the Washington Post in promoting what is essentially a very narrow range of opinion. Very good point. U.S. policymakers are increasingly out of step, not only with the younger portions of the population, but with the majority of the population on all of these issues of militarism and imperialism, extending an already overextended empire abroad while neglecting crucial problems at home, and indeed crucial global problems such as climate change and nuclear war. The mainstream media landscape is extraordinarily monochromatic and complicit in every way with government policies, and yet it doesn't represent the popular point of view, which is why the obsessive references by our policymakers to, quote, protecting our democracy, unquote, ring so hollow, so hypocritical and unconvincing. Yeah, because we don't have a democracy anymore. And they have a big part. The mainstream media landscape is a big reason why we don't have any democracy anymore. So it doesn't seem to me there's an opportunity here for a peace movement to address that gap. to speak to that disconnect between elite opinion and broad popular opinion. Oh, yeah? How do we address that gap? And it seems to me, as I said, I mean, we can talk about the gap. There is a big gap. It seems to me, as I said, any peace movement has to be an anti imperialist movement. So there has to be a kind of realistic recognition of the actual power relations, the huge economic investment, but also the huge ideological and emotional investment of powerful people in the existing order. Yes, 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 that's very right. We have to acknowledge that obstacle, and we have to figure out ways to address it. I completely agree. Now, what are the ways to address it? But we also have to figure out ways to broaden the appeal beyond the narrow ideological framework of anti imperialism. And I have two ways to suggest, not ways of depoliticizing, but of softening the political edge and broadening its appeal. And those words are veterans and churches. As I'm recalling from peace movements of the past, both of these groups played critical roles. And I think they're both positioned to do so now more than ever. Veterans for Peace, for example, is an extraordinarily savvy and politically smart organization that is doing a lot of important work to change the conversation. And it's an uphill slog, there's no getting around it. Okay, the stenographers are always going to be at work protecting their access, making up stories, embracing Israeli, Ukrainian, and U.S. government propaganda uncritically. But I do think we have a potential opening here if we could figure out ways to walk through it. I know, but what are the ways to walk through it? And what are the ways to get the stenographers acting, okay, in different ways? What specifically would Veterans for Peace have to do? What specifically would the churches have to do? Here's Jeffrey Sachs. U.S. foreign policy has one gear in one direction, which is war all the time, not stop. There's no diplomacy at all. They don't understand diplomacy one bit. Most of the actual motives of foreign policy are disguised or, let's say, falsified in the official narratives. So we have three wars, two hot, one cold, going on right now. Ukraine and Gaza, the two hot wars, and very high tensions with China as a Cold War in Asia. It's just U.S. belligerence. Morning till night, till morning till night. The Ukraine war is a war of NATO's enlargement, actually pure and simple. It goes back 30 years. It was a strategy to weaken Russia after 1992, after the Soviet Union dissolved. They couldn't take yes for an answer and make peace. They wanted to fill in all of the space that the Soviet Union left behind with American hegemony and military bases. Thanks, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Thanks, Wolfowitz. Thanks to the Clintons. Thanks to Obama. Thanks to Trump. Thanks to Biden. So NATO enlargement began. It kept pushing toward Russia's borders. The Russians' absolute red line was Ukraine, a point made repeatedly by the Russians, actually repeatedly, including by William Burns, the U.S. ambassador to Russia in 2008, now our CIA director, in a famous memo that we know of only because of Julian Assange. By the way, I had a stream on Julian Assange earlier this afternoon. You might want to take a look at it. Who made public what should have been absolutely public for the U.S., and that is "niet" means "niet" when it comes to expanding NATO to Ukraine. Well, long story short, we don't have a reverse gear. We don't have a diplomatic gear. They just kept trying until today. There's no pausing when it comes to Gaza. This is also a war that is caused by now 57 years of Israel's determination to hold on to everything that it got in the 1967 war. And everything else has been delaying tactics. But from 1967 onward, the goal has been to hold on to the territory, settle it, put in hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers. Thanks, Golda Meir. Now we have, quote, facts on the ground, unquote, for 57 years of disaster and cruelty. And we have a genocide going on right now. I absolutely believe that Israel is violating the 1948 Genocide Convention, and not even in subtle ways. Then we have tensions with China. This is blamed on China, but it's actually an American policy that began under President Barack Obama, because China's success triggered every American hegemonic antibody that says China's becoming too big and powerful. Hey, got a little secret. China's always been too big population wise. It's always been many multiples of the US population for as far back as I can remember. That is not a recent thing. So it's not that China is becoming too big, it's more that China is becoming too powerful because now all the masses of China have cohered into a very powerful and well organized nation that's very strong economically, very strong technologically, and very strong militarily. It's now a threat because of its size, not because of its actions, but because of its size. China has not been involved in one war for more than 40 years, but we regard China as the belligerent. I agree with Jeff. China has not been belligerent towards us. There's no comparison between the belligerence of China towards us and our belligerence towards China. It's completely one sided. We should not regard them, okay, as the belligerent. They are too big and powerful, but that's reality. There's nothing we could do about that. I mean, they were 1.5 billion people. They've been 1.5 billion people for long. Their population's been going down lately. They're only 1.4 billion now. But they've been that big in population for a long time. What they did is they built themselves up. They brought a huge number of people, okay, out of poverty. They have an economic dynamic that is much greater than ours, and they have built themselves up, okay, over a period of time, and they did it uh, through their own efforts. Now we helped by farming out a lot of our manufacturing to China. If we'd had an ounce of sense, we would have prohibited that. If we had, okay, an ounce of sense, we never would have let our capitalist class go crazy by farming out our industries to China. We would have recognized that that was a threat to our national security. But no, why? Because that capitalist class was running America and it was good for them, and they didn't care what was good for America. They didn't care what was good for working people there. They didn't want to pay the cost of working people here. They wanted the cheap labor. So China got all this manufacturing business, all this manufacturing activity, and it helped them to grow. I'm not trying to take any credit, away from them. They've been fantastic internally in terms of their ability to come together and make things happen. What I'm saying is that uh, our desire to offshore, okay, our manufacturing played a big role in them becoming so-called too big, okay, and too powerful. But even if we hadn't done that, even if other countries hadn't started offshoring, okay, their manufacturing, even if everybody was looking to their own national security, China would be a very important and powerful factor today because they would have done it solely internally. They were determined to do it, and they have a workforce that's a great workforce, and they made it better and better and better as time had gone on. So they would have done it anyway. They would have been a major power today. Going on, and so we have surrounded China with our military. We're building up new alliances in the Pacific Rim of China. We're trying to control choke points at sea. And when China reacts, we say, you see, there are danger there, want to take over the world. So the long and short of it, we have a foreign policy that is built by the military-industrial complex. Yes, it is not in the interest of the American people. It is maintained through lies and fear-mongering, yeah, and the role of the media, of course, very important here. It is leading to destruction, as it has been for decades in wars all over the world. And Biden, we don't know about Biden's capacities at this point, physically and mentally, but he has demonstrated no capacity for diplomacy at all. The situation is absolutely dreadful. I think we all are saying strongly diplomacy What happened to it? Where did it go? We don't even see a word of it. It's unbelievable. And learning again to listen, to talk, to exchange, and the idea that actually peace is not a bad thing, we should try to do it. I agree with all this, but the point is, how do we get them to switch to diplomacy and switch away from using the gun, okay, and the bomb and the planes, okay, and the tanks? How do we get them to switch? How do we get them to recognize that the main instrument of foreign policy has got to be diplomacy, okay, and economic tools? That it can't be the military, because nobody wants to contend with our military any longer. They don't want the bases there any longer. They don't want U.S. power projected in their areas, okay, any longer. What they want is independence from us. And unless we get out of the military dimension, they won't deal with us. They won't deal with us, okay, at all anymore, because our military is a threat to their independence. But again, how do we get our rulers to see that? Phyliss Bennis says, I think what we need is both a strengthening of the specifically focused movements, most particularly about Gaza, which I'll get to in a few seconds. But we also need broad anti-militarism, anti-military spending movements, particularly those that link to the other movements that are focusing on labor rights, on anti-racism, on environmental justice, on immigrant rights, on LGBTQ rights, on women's rights. In all of those areas, people are paying the price for the cost of the war focus of U.S. foreign policy. Couldn't agree more. In that context, but again, how do we get them to change? How do we get the focus to change? We know the focus is caused by the military-industrial complex and the interaction of that complex with the political system and with the social system. We know that. How do we get off the military-industrial complex addictive drug? It's like an addictive drug for us. In that context, we need much broader outreach from the Palestinian rights movement. There's a lot of focus on consolidation, the movement on getting the strongest and most powerful expressions. But in my view, what's actually more powerful and more important than that right now is building on the breadth of that movement that we're seeing rising spontaneously. She's now focusing on Gaza, strictly, focusing on Gaza, which is not the general point that we're seeking. Is very important, of course, but it was 1,000 black ministers in the New York Times signing on to the demand for ceasefire. The rabbis for ceasefire occupying the Security Council chamber at the UN. These things are hugely important in terms not just of being part of a movement, but of showing the world the breadth of this movement. So I think that broadening becomes much more important, grabbing the spontaneous opposition that's out there, pulling that into the movement with less concern about the role of the left within that and the anti-imperialist component of it. I think Phyliss is right about that. I think right now we need to talk about people's lives, and that means a movement demanding an immediate and permanent ceasefire. Ceasefire isn't the most left, the most anti-imperialist demand, whatever. It's what we need to stop the killing, and that's the movement that we need right now. We also need those broader anti-imperialist movements, but right now we need a movement for a ceasefire. I entirely agree with Phyliss about that. Got to stop the genocide. We've got to stop the genocide. Lears. I want to agree strongly with Phyliss that in the current emergency, the absolutely urgent task is a ceasefire in Gaza. I've never felt the pain and sadness and anger I felt for the last few months, probably not since the Vietnam War, when I have known in such detail what was going on with my country's avid assistance and complicity. We're all endlessly confronted each day by the number of lives that are being destroyed, and families torn up out of their surroundings and deported shamelessly, children actually targeted by snipers. I mean, it goes on and on. If you pay any attention, if you refuse to look away, then you're outraged, okay, and appalled. And that is absolutely right. I feel the outrage and am appalled every single effing day. So is Bonnie. So is everybody I know who pays attention to this. Now, what's so striking to me about my colleagues in the academy Not all of them by any means at Rutgers. Yeah, so he's at Rutgers. We have a chapter of the Faculty for Justice in Palestine. I thought he was from Princeton. He's from Rutgers. And I signed on to it. And we back up the students supporting Palestine, of whom there are many. But what I find so strange about what seemed like a majority of my colleagues is that there's a kind of business as usual approach to everyday life, and that I find very hard to emulate. And I feel like we have to try to reorient the everyday discussion away from business as usual on social media, the recognition just in human terms of what's happening. So, it's not as if I feel like you have to have a clearly worked out vision of American empire to criticize what's happening in Gaza. You just have to have a few shreds of human sympathy. And that's what I think we need to try to address and work with as advocates for peace, okay, in opposition to a genocide. Think about the Air Force flyer who immolated himself in front of the Israeli embassy with the words, quote, "Free Palestine" on his lips. He was yet, okay, another example of where we are now in this crisis. Question: what are the most important dangers of nuclear war? Lears, I think one can start answering that question by simply saying they're the same dangers that have always been there: accidents, miscalculation, confrontation. All of these events could involve either human or algorithmic error. On one occasion, 40 some years ago, a mistaken computer very, very nearly got Russian missiles launched on the basis of the way the sun happened to be hitting the clouds. This is what the computer mistook for an incoming invasion. This was in the beginning of the Gorbachev era. A Russian colonel risked his career and his life, probably, by calling off the launch because he sensed it was a mistake. And he was right, so that's how close we came. And I'm sure that incident influenced Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and his gestures to former U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Reagan himself was influenced not only by the people in the street demanding a nuclear freeze, he was also profoundly influenced by the movie The Day After, which he watched twice. I'm no fan of Reagan's, believe me. I'm sure, where my anti-war colleagues were with respect to almost everything he did. But on this question, he became a nuclear pacifist, though that didn't survive the influence of his advisors, Richard Pearl in particular. All this is history. Times have changed. We still have all the same dangers, all the same cataclysmic possibilities. Though we have a different context now, yeah, the Ukrainian context, right? Which is again to return to what seems like a leitmotif here: the refusal of diplomacy and the scrapping of any arms control treaties that have resulted from previous diplomacy. Hence, the bulletin of the atomic scientists has moved their doomsday clock to 90 seconds, the closest it's ever been. We have no lines of connection open to other major nuclear powers, and especially Russia. We're not in touch the way Cold War presidents were in touch, even in the worst days of the Cold War. And we don't have the same popular sense of threat and urgency that I think existed during most of our lives from childhood on. All of us lived under the shadow of nuclear war. All of us encountered those diagrams with concentric circles surrounding the cities where we happened to be growing up, charts and graphs that showed where a nuclear bomb's impact would be the greatest and how it would continue for hundreds of miles outside that ground zero. We don't have those kinds of things staring us in the face anymore, and it's not part of our popular culture the way it was back in the 1960s and 70s and earlier. We need to rekindle that sense of threat and urgency along with reviving diplomacy. Hey, I agree with that. That is where we are, and I would say the danger is particularly strong in the Middle East, given the nature of the current Israeli government, especially the fanaticism of the cabinet, along with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself. It's possible that Israel's government could turn to nuclear weapons if their ethnic cleansing project is thwarted. I certainly agree with that. And in Europe, we are in comparable danger, given the eagerness of blustering NATO leaders to provoke Russian President Vladimir Putin, who responds in kind. We're starting this dance of death again, the dance we thought had ended with the Cold War. One of the partners has to step aside. I mentioned on these live streams many times before the biggest failure of President Joe Biden is foreign policy, which has gotten us into the risk of nuclear war for the first time since the 1980s. Jackson Lears is talking about that here, talking about the dance of death with respect to the escalation leads to, a nuclear war. We're getting signs of this, in the Middle East. We've had signs of it, in Ukraine before. Fortunately, the Russians, are winning there. And I don't think Ukraine means quite so much to the West as to risk, a nuclear war, with Russia. The biggest risk in terms of the intervention, in Ukraine would have come if there had developed through victories of the Ukrainians an existential threat, to Russia. If that had happened, it might have been possible that Putin would start using nuclear weapons. Fortunately, he hasn't even tried, even thought of using them, because from the beginning, Russia was successful enough with conventional arms to exclude that. And to this day, their chance of winning is so great that the nuclear threat in Europe is receding now. And we see it receding, and that is good. But Jackson Lears is right. In the Middle East, there is a nuclear threat, and that threat comes from Israel. If there's an existential threat to Israel's existence, as there may be, because right now Israel is under pressure from a number of different sides from the axis of resistance in that area, which is much more powerful than it's ever been before. And the military authorities I listen to are saying to me that Israel is losing this war. As they get closer and closer to losing this war, it seems to me, especially since we're talking about the fanaticism of the cabinet, along with Prime Minister Netanyahu, it seems to me Israel might turn to nuclear war, specifically starting one, against Iran. I think that's a possibility. I think if that were to happen, there would be nuclear retaliation from other countries that are close to Iran and that have access, to nuclear weapons. You can't use any nuclear weapons in Israel. It's so small. Any kind, of nuclear weapon there would create severe problems for habitability in that particular case. But still, the Israelis might turn to that if they thought a first strike could win them, the war. So we have to watch for that. That's the risk of nuclear war by right now. Now, in terms of the dance of death, there's not only a dance of death in terms of the Middle East that's a possibility, but if the U.S. keeps pushing in Europe, keeps pushing in Asia, the Chinese have their warheads, they have their missiles, they have their capability to attack the United States, and they would be backed by Russia. So if we ever produced an existential threat to China with our arms, we would have an existential threat of our own to face. We can't afford to have the dance of death, again. We have to stop the escalations, now. As the folks here are saying, we have to go to diplomacy. Again, though, the political problem. How do we get the people in Congress and the people in the executive branch to end this aggressive foreign policy and to use diplomacy. Bennis says, the only thing I would add, I think there is an escalated danger from accidental escalation toward a nuclear weapon. That's particularly in Ukraine, certainly possible in many places, but particularly Ukraine. It's different than in Syria, where the U.S. and Russia were faced off against each other, including troops as well as pilots and whatever on the ground on opposite sides. But in Syria, they had a military-to-military hotline. There was some arms control agreement still intact. They provided at least a basis for a conversation between the two sides if things got even hotter. Now, the possibility of an accidental escalation, which are never really accidental because the wars that create the circumstances in which they could occur are not accidents, but in the sense it's not the intention of the people at the top of the power pyramid on either side to launch a nuclear weapon. And yet escalation happens. That's the accidental nature of it. So I think that the lack of direct military-to-military contact, the lack of diplomatic contact, the lack of existing arms control agreements, the virtual collapse of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, I think it is a more dangerous moment. And I certainly agree. But again, our friends here have not told us how to stop this. I mean, what does it mean to say to the President of the United States, stop using the military, use diplomacy, you fool? I mean, that's basically what they're saying. It's basically what they're saying to all of us. That's not enough. We got to get rid of the influence of the military-industrial complex. How is the influence of the military-industrial complex? How is it manifested? It's manifested through the role of money in politics. We know all of that. With respect to Israel, it's manifested through AIPAC and its allies. The connection of money to what's going on in Israel is very, very clear right now. Okay, the connection of money to Biden not stopping Israel long ago from the genocide is very, very, very much in evidence right now. What if we had over these months? What if we had the development of the dump the corruption movement here? What if people in Congress were facing that right now? What if they were facing a large dump the corruption movement threatening all of their office holding in the upcoming election in 2024 unless they stop taking money from the military-industrial complex and other powerful interests that are in back of war? I think we would be looking at an entirely different problem now. I think the answer, the reason why people don't use diplomacy more and turn to the military more is because of money in politics. Again, it comes back to that. It comes back to dump the corruption. And I think that is a key here. Now let's get to the second half of the show. I didn't mean to make it such a long show, but that was such a good piece to comment on. I just couldn't resist. I hope you still appreciate what's going on here. But anyway, too loud? Oh, I'm sorry. I've been too loud. But you can always turn down the sound, Kay. You can always turn down the sound for me. Okay, there are 11 people here, but very few people are commenting, which I find there must be many people watching me on Twitter. So, here's another article by Pepe Escobar. Okay, it's rather an amazing piece. I'll start on the piece in just a moment. But I did want to share this. Okay, I did want to share this on Facebook. Okay. So that's done. Now let's go to Pepe's piece. It's, as usual, fascinating. Uh, it's particularly important when you couple it with the dance of death perspective, because Russia and China aren't trying to engage in a dance of death, okay, with us. What they're trying to do is in the title. Russia and China sketch the future as the world awaits Iran's next move, which may further escalate, okay, in the Middle East. But if Iran manages the escalation well, then Russia and China's sketching of the future becomes more important. There's a picture of Sergei Lavrov shaking the hand of Wang Yi, a foreign minister, okay, of China. Sergei Lavrov is the foreign minister, okay, of Russia, the equivalent of our Secretary of State, for those who don't know. Pepe says, the whole planet awaits with bated breath the avowedly inevitable Iranian response to the attack against its consulate ambassador residence in Damascus by the biblical psychopaths responsible for the Gaza genocide. Enveloped in an aura of secrecy, each passing day betrays the immensity of the challenge. The possible asymmetrical response must be simultaneously symbolic, substantive, cogent, convincing, reasonable, okay, and rational. That is driving Tel Aviv totally hysterical. And the deciding instances of the hegemon, he doesn't know who the deciding instances are. He doesn't know whether Joe Biden's a deciding instance. He's probably referring to Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and any behind-the-scenes characters that are sitting around there. The deciding instances, funny, of the hegemon extremely itchy. Everyone with a functioning brain knows this wet dream of a stunt from the point of view of hardcore Zionists and U.S. Christian Ziocons. That's interesting terminology. U.S. Christian Ziocons. The fundamentalist Christians who were waiting for the second coming. It was a serious provocation designed to draw the U.S. to the long-cherished Israeli plan of striking a blow against both Hezbollah and Tehran. The IDF's chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, all but gave away the game when he said this past Sunday that, quote, we are operating in cooperation with the USA and strategic partners in the region. Translation, never trust the hegemon, even as the notion is floated via Swiss mediators that Washington won't interfere with Tehran's response to Tel Aviv. One just needs to remember Washington's, quote, assurances, unquote, to Saddam Hussein before the first Gulf War. It is impossible to take hegemon back-channel assurances at face value. The White House and the Pentagon occasionally dispense these, quote, quote, assurances, unquote, to Moscow every time Kyiv strikes deep inside the Russian Federation using US-UK satellite intel logistics weaponry and with NATO in de facto operational control. So Pepe is suggesting we're fighting the air war for them. We're fighting the missile war for them. We're running it. We have de facto control. We're directly fighting the Russians and getting beat, by the way. The state terror attack on Damascus, which shredded the Vienna Convention on diplomatic immunity, which convention has been around forever, crucially was also an attack on both the expanded BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO. Iran is a member of both of these multilateral bodies, and on top of it is engaged in strategic partnerships with both Russia and China. Is a tweet from Sputnik International, quote, if Iran attacks from its territory, Israel will respond and attack in Iran, unquote. Israel's foreign minister threatened Iran with strikes, tweeting in Hebrew and Persian, and attacking Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. It's not Khomeini, folks, it's Khamenei. Khomeini is long dead. Okay. Iran's Supreme Leader, for his part, later said that the Israeli, check this one out, check this tweet out, said that later said the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Syria was, quote, as if Israel has attacked Iranian soil. It was Iranian soil. It was the consulate. That's Iranian soil. That a malicious regime has made a wrong move. It should be punished, and it will be punished, unquote. He wrote, okay, on X. He did. Okay, back to the article. So it's no wonder the leadership in both Beijing and Moscow is carefully considering all possible repercussions of the next Iranian move. Tel Aviv's purposeful escalation when it comes to expanding war in West Asia happens to mirror another escalation. NATO's no way out in Ukraine except by doubling down with no end in sight. That started with the invariably out of his death Secretary of State little Tony Blinken affirming on the record that Ukraine will, italics mine, join NATO, which any functioning brain knows is translatable as the roadmap towards a Russia-NATO hot war with unbelievable dire consequences. Little Blinky's criminal irresponsibility was duly picked up and reverberated by the Franco-British duo, as expressed by British Foreign Minister David of Arabia Cameron and French Foreign Minister Stephanie Sejourne. Quote, if Ukraine loses, we all lose, unquote. At least they got that, italics mine, right. Although that took ages when it comes to framing NATO's approaching cosmic humiliation. Quote, isn't Pepe wonderful? Quote, dual opposition, unquote, to quote, dual deterrence, unquote. Now let's switch from clownish bit players to the adults in the room. As Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Russian and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi discussing literally every incandescent dossier together earlier this week in Beijing, Lavrov and Wang could not be clearer on what's ahead for the Russia-China strategic partnership. They will engage together on all matters regarding Eurasian security. They will go, in Lavrov's words, for, quote, dual opposition, unquote, to counterpunch the West's, quote, dual deterrence. Excuse me, I needed that tea. They will be countering every attempt by the usual suspects to, quote, slow down the natural course of history, and to it, the confirmation that President Putin and President Xi will hold at least two bilateral conferences in 2024 at the SCO Summit in June and at the BRICS Summit in October. In a nutshell, the dogs of forever wars bark while the Eurasian integration caravan marches on. Sputnik also tweets, Pepe Escobar, Russia-China partnership defangs empire. And let's see what that gets us here following that particular link. Oh, that's a reference to a piece from September 29, 2023 by Pepe, Russia-China partnership defangs. Okay, the U.S. empire, what's that about? Uh, okay, I will go through that. I'm going to keep that in mind, and I'm going to go through that at some time because that's a fascinating piece, and I missed it. I did go through it at the time, but it lays out, in many ways, the map of what's going on in the development of the strategic partnership between Russia and China. Both Lavrov and Wang made it very clear that while steering through the quote natural course of history unquote, the Russia China strategic partnership will keep seeking a way to resolve the Ukraine tragedy, taking into account Russia's interest. Translation: NATO better wake up and smell the coffee. This bilateral at the foreign minister level in Beijing is yet another graphic proof of the current tectonic shift in what the Chinese usually describe as the quote world correlation of forces unquote. Next month, already confirmed, it will be Putin's turn to visit Beijing. It's never enough to remember that on February 4th, 2022, also in Beijing, Putin personally explained to Xi why NATO/hegemon expansion into Ukraine was totally unacceptable for Russia. Xi, for all practical purposes, understood the stakes and did not subsequently oppose the special military operation. This time, Lavrov could not but refer to the 12-point peace plan on Ukraine proposed by Beijing last year, which addresses the root causes, quote, primarily in the context of ensuring indivisible security, including in Europe and the world over, unquote. Your overcapacity, quote unquote, is driving me nuts. Both Tehran and Moscow face a serious challenge when it comes to the hegemon's intentions. It is impossible to definitely conclude that Washington was not in the loop on Tel Aviv's attack on Iran and Damascus, even though it's counterintuitive to believe that Democrats in an election year would willingly fuel a nasty hot war in West Asia provoked by Israel. Yet there's always the possibility that the White House endorsed genocide in Gaza is about to extrapolate the framework of confrontation between Israel and Iran axis of resistance, as the hegemon is de facto implicated in myriad levels. To alleviate such tension, let's introduce what the circumstances can be understood as comic relief. The quote, Yellen goes to China, unquote, adventure that references to Janet Yellen, of course. U.S. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen went to Beijing to essentially deliver two threats. This is the hegemon, after all. First, Yellen said that Chinese companies could face, quote, significant consequences, unquote, uh, if they provided any material support, quote, any material support for Russia's war in Ukraine, unquote. Yellen accused Chinese companies of, quote, overcapacity, quote unquote, especially when it comes to the electric vehicle industry. Incidentally, 18 of the top 20 electric vehicle companies around the world are Chinese. The Chinese predictably dismissed the whole show with barely a yawn, pointing out that the hegemon simply cannot deal with China's competitive advantage, so they resort to yet another instance of, quote, de-risking, unquote, hype. In sum, it's all about barely disguised protectionism. Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao went straight to the point. China's advantage is built on innovation, not subsidies. Others added two extra key factors: the efficiency of supply chains and ultra dynamic market competition. EVs in China, along with the lithium batteries and solar cells, are known as the new, quote, three major items, okay, unquote, which, by the way, suggests, okay, a vulnerability to China, I think, that we ought to take advantage in. That is, if we can not technologically make obsolete lithium batteries, okay, in favor of others, which we have easy access to the materials for, then we can put a crimp in what China, okay, is doing here, because those batteries might well replace lithium batteries in cars, because those batteries are pretty heavy. We need something better. If we can beat China to something better, we can be a lot more competitive. Just a thought. Yellen's theatrics in Beijing should be easily identified as yet another desperate gambit by a former hyperpower which no longer enjoys military supremacy. No dominant Mickey Matt, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia think tank complex, in the brilliant formulation by Ray McGovern, no fully controlled logistics and sea lanes, no invulnerable petrodollar, no enforced indiscriminate fear of sanctions, and most of all, not even the fear itself, replaced across the global south by rage and utter contempt for the imperial support for the genocide in Gaza. Just a tawdry Greek tragedy remix. Once again, it's up to the inestimable Michael Hudson to succinctly nail it all down. Quote, the official U.S. position recognizes that it can't be an industrial exporter anymore. Though how is it going to balance the international payments to support the dollar's exchange rate? The solution is rent seeking. That's why the United States says, well, what's the main new rent seeking opportunity in world trade? Well, it's information technology and computer technology. That's why the United States is fighting China so much, and why President Biden has said again and again that China is the number one enemy. It moved first against Huawei for the 5G communications, and now it's trying to get Europe and American and Taiwanese exporters not to export a computer chip to China, not for the Dutch to export chip engraving machinery to China. There's a belief that somehow the United States can prevent other countries from producing high technology intellectual property rents, then other countries will be dependent. Rent seeking really means dependency of other countries if they don't have a choice to pay you much more money than the actual cost of production. That's rent, the price over value. Well, the United States, since it can't compete on value because of the high cost of living and labor here, it can only monopolize rent. Well, China has not been deterred. China has leapfrogged over the United States and is producing its own etching machinery, its own computer chips. The question is, what is the rest of the world doing? Well, the rest of the world means, on the one hand, the global majority, Eurasia, the BRICS Plus, and on the other hand, Western Europe. Western Europe is right in the middle of all this. Is it really going to forego the much less expensive Chinese exports at cost, including normal profit, or is it going to let itself be locked into American rent extraction technology, not only for computer chips, but for military arms? Graphically, this eventful week provided yet another howler. Xi officially received Lavrov when Yellen was still in Beijing. Chinese scholars note how Beijing's position in a convoluted triad is admirably flexible compared to the vicious deadlock of U.S.-Russia relations. No one knows how the deadlock may be broken. What is clear is that the Russia-China leadership, as well as Iran's, know full well the dangers roaming the chessboard when the usual suspects seem to go all out gambling everything, even knowing that they are outgunned, outproduced, outnumbered, and outwitted. It's a tawdry Greek tragedy. A Greek tragedy remix, all right, yet without the pathos and grandeur of Sophocles, featuring just a bunch of nasty, brutish specimens plunging into their unblinking, self-inflicted doom. So, the Russia-China way out of the dance of death is to go right ahead with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the BRICS, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with the development of all of the nations, of Eurasia through their efforts, with the development and the acceleration of the emergence of the multipolar world. That is what they're doing on the side while the conflicts, God bless you, honey, while the conflicts in Ukraine and in Gaza, and in the Middle East and West Asia, are going on. They are proceeding with their plans. They are proceeding with their overcapacity and their fantastic economic competitiveness, while we stay mired inside, of Ukraine, and now mired down in Gaza as well, which we should have long since stopped the genocide being perpetrated by the Israelis by withholding arms from them. We should have done that months ago. We should have done that almost immediately. Had we done that almost immediately, that Israel would not be guilty of genocide right now. Israel would have been forced to come to the table with the Palestinians. There might have been an agreement by now on a Palestinian state if the United States had pressured Israel hard from the start, because Israel's military capability to carry the genocide out was supplied by the United States, which is complicit, in the genocide. We could have ended that war. We could have ended both of those crises long since, and we could have, if we had any sense, turned to the task, the really important task of rebuilding, restructuring our foreign policy so that it becomes a model of competition in the area, of innovation and cooperation with other nations. That is what we need. But of course, to have that happen, it would have been necessary for the Biden administration to turn away from the military-industrial complex, to turn away from the donors, to turn away from the sordid process, of government and politics that it is supporting right now, and to turn towards something rational, something long-term, something hopeful, specifically collaboration with other nations of the world in the sandbox of the multipolar world, collaboration through diplomacy, collaboration supplemented by competition for prosperity, for our prosperity, prosperity in the West, prosperity, in the rest of the world, and protection, especially from the climate, emergency. That is what we needed our government to do. That is what we did not get. Our foreign policy is a miserable failure. And if it continues to be a miserable failure, the Russia and China vision of the world will govern and determine, the future. And we will not have a part in that. We will not have a seat, at the table, because when Pepe Escobar refers to the hegemon right now, he is referring to the hegemon, okay, in a very sarcastic way, because as any fool can plainly see, we are no longer the hegemon. That's the truth. And as Jackson Lears said in the first article I went through tonight, we have to face up to that. We are a declining empire. We should hasten, okay, the decline of the empire. We should end the empire and turn back to developing ourselves as a nation that is worthy of collaboration and that is worthy of admiration from the rest of the world. That is what should happen. That is what must happen. I look forward, okay, to its happening. I'll take any questions. I'm about now. There are very few comments here, so I don't have much more to say. So what I'm going to do is say goodnight, and I'm going to hightail it over to Dee's show. She has a show tonight.
She said you were a little late.
Oh, has she said that I was late?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yes. I am running late, but I am going over there now. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and I'll see you tomorrow with another show.